Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Outlandish Talmud Stories and Outstanding Life Lessons. Tonight's topic, the most famous apostate in Jewish history. It's a very interesting class, certainly very outlandish, but also very outstanding life lessons. I want to thank tonight's sponsor, Lainey Stern, who has dedicated tonight's class for the complete and speedy refuah shlema of Mina Rachel Bat Yochevet. May God extend to her compassion, kindness, and the blessings of healing. Her betoch she'ar cholei Yisrael, among all others who need healing. May she have b'serat tavat very soon. We continue to pray for her recovery right away. If you'd like to dedicate a class and help us do what we're doing, there's a link in the video description. Please go ahead and dedicate one in honor of a loved one, in memory of a loved one, and that would help us tremendously. The source sheet for tonight you can find in the video description. Tonight is a bit of a different style class, different style source sheet than regular. Normally we're taking one story from the Talmud and we're studying it and then analyzing it, but because this time I've gathered many different bits and pieces, different stories, different anecdotes from all over Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, the Jerusalem Talmud, the Medrash, because I'm trying to piece together a complete picture of tonight's topic. And you'll bear with me, it'll be super interesting. And I'm also going to try some new technology over here and try to get the source sheet on the screen for those who are unable to download it. So we'll see if that works out. Okay, so we're going back about 1900 years ago. This is a very challenging, difficult time in Jewish history. This is after the destruction of the temple. The Romans destroy the temple, but more than that, they destroy Israel, and they butcher and they murder hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of Jewish people, and exile the rest. Jewish sovereignty, the Jewish people, the Jewish spirit has been completely decimated. So much so that the question on everyone's mind is, what lies in our future? Will there be a future for the Jewish people? Will we ever get back to being a nation with sovereignty over our land, the land of Israel? In fact, there are some emergency meetings that are being called together by great leaders and rabbis of the time to try to figure out how to move forward. Some are suggesting we should stop having children. There is no future. Why bring children into a world like this? And other outrageous suggestions, which thankfully none of these were actually accepted. And then a little while post the destruction of the temple is the famous or infamous Bar Kokhba revolt. Bar Kokhba, the great Jewish warrior and general, a very special person, a very altruistic person, supported by none other than Rabbi Akiva, who was the great Jewish leader of the time, supporting his final revolt against the Romans, hoping that the Jews, even though they're few and they're relatively weak compared to the Romans, who are large and powerful, could eventually destroy them and eventually bring back sovereignty to the Jewish people in the Jewish land. And Rabbi Akiva says Bar Kokhba could be the Mashiach. This might be the final battle to end the story of exile, to end the persecution. So a lot of hopes were put into this thing, and it didn't work out. And Bar Kokhba was killed, and it was a failure. And perhaps they were dreaming of another Hanukkah miracle where even the few and the weak could overpower the mighty, powerful, strong armies of the Assyrian Greeks. This time that miracle did not happen, and the Jews were completely destroyed. The Talmud has stories about Beitar and other cities that are very gruesome to read about the extent of the damage, the murder, the butchering, the torture, the destruction that the Romans brought. And then we have the story over a number of decades of Asara Haruge Malchus, the 10 great rabbis who were martyred, who were killed in a most gruesome way by the Romans. It's a story we read about in Yom Kippur in our prayers. We read about it on Tisha B'Av. There are different versions of the story, but doesn't matter the version, the facts are, if you read about the greatest of rabbis, the greatest of leaders who were celebrated by the Romans about their butchery, being butchered to death, as we're going to learn a little bit tonight about that also. So now, put yourself in those shoes. Living during that time, the only way that I I think we can relate a little bit to that is if we're familiar with the generation after the Holocaust. Think about our grandparents or great-grandparents who went through the Holocaust, or the people that were born immediately after the Holocaust. Think about those first 20, 30, 40 years after the Holocaust and the many challenges that survivors and their children had during those years. And so that sets the scene for understanding now about some of the characters and the people we're going to be studying about tonight. Tonight, we're studying about a very fascinating and very tragic story about somebody who was once a very great rabbi. And even though he was the greatest of the great and the highest of the high, but he fell to a very low level. He became an apostate. So he was a rabbi and he became a renegade. He was a sage and he became a sinner. And I'm talking about none other than Elisha Ben Avuya. That's his name, Elisha, the son of Avuya. Who was he? What's his story? What happened to him? How did he reach so high and how did he fall so low? And why didn't he come back? Even though there was so much communal pressure, even though those were his roots, that was his education, that was his childhood, that's where he succeeded. And nonetheless, once he left, he refused to come back. What happened over here? And this is a very, very important story to learn. You know, if he did become an apostate, and he became actually a very big threat to the Jewish community eventually, and we're going to learn stories about that. And such a person you want to forget about, and you want to just write off history and have no record and no memory of such a person. And the rabbis could have easily have done that. They could have just not spoken about him. And if he's not recorded in the Talmud, if he's not recorded in the ancient Jewish literature, he would have forgotten about. Who would remember him a few generations later? But yet, you know, the best way to destroy someone is just to forget about them. However, the sages consistently talk about him, tell stories about him, pay attention to his story. There's even a few teachings of his still included in the Talmud or in the Mishnah. The fact that they keep talking about him means that there's something important for us to learn about him and to learn from him. And that's what we're going to try to do tonight. Who was Elisha Ben Avuya? He was born perhaps either towards the end of the 1st century, at the transition after the destruction of the temple. He was born in Jerusalem. We know he was born to prominent and wealthy and illustrious family. We know that as we're going to learn a story soon. He was a contemporary of the great Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was spoken about many times, who was the great leader of the time. So he was one of the who's who. He's one of the great sages. And yet of all the more than 1,000 sages that the Talmud speaks about and we learn about, he's the only one that we get told about, that he, perhaps one of the only ones, that he didn't make it through. And he went off the beaten path. He went astray and he lived a very heretical life. Let's learn about him and try to understand what happened and to answer some of our questions. So you have the source sheet in the link over there, and I'm also going to see if I can share my screen so we can actually do the source sheet together. And here we are. So first question that we have, I want to address, who was Elisha Ben Avuya? So here, again, we don't know too much about him, as I mentioned, but here we have a quote in the Medrash of Ruth, of Megillat Ruth. The Medrash Rabbi in chapter 6 says as follows. It was told about Elisha Ben Avuya that there was never anyone as great, as wise, as strong as him who was barred entry into the temple. The temple means the study hall. The temple didn't exist anymore. When he used to lecture in the study halls of Tiberias, all of the other sages and students would gather around him, listen intently to his words, and when he concluded, they would all kiss him on his head. Elisha Ben Avuya's words were gold, and they were authoritative. And even if somebody else had their opinion or their teaching, but when he spoke up, the whole room hushed. Everyone wanted to listen to him. He was popular. He was the attraction of the time. Everyone wanted to be a student of his. He was somebody you wanted to be around. That sets the stage for us understanding how great of a person Elisha Ben Avuya was. Now, something happened in the middle of his life where he turned away. He became a heretic. He became an apostate. He left the Jewish people. He left his faith in God. Perhaps he definitely had some kind of foreign faith. It's not clear whether he started to believe in the Zoroastrian faith of the duality of different gods, whether he became into Gnosticism or other spiritual fads of the time, but he left the Jewish faith altogether. In fact, he actually joined and partnered up with the Romans, and as we're going to discover, so much was his spite of the Jewish people, of his old community, that he actually worked together with the Romans to threaten, to punish, to injure, to harm his own people, the Jewish people. How could that happen? So, why did he go astray? Now, it's important when we ask that question to think about the following. Whenever you have somebody who, as we say, goes off the derech, goes off the beaten path, is raised in a prominent Jewish home, gets a proper Jewish education, is immersed in Torah life and Jewish lifestyle, and then they leave it. And you ask the question, why? What happened? And sometimes it's tempting to say, I know the answer. Something happened in his childhood. He had a poor experience with a certain teacher. Maybe there was some kind of trauma or abuse or something, or somebody let him down, and that's why it happened. Now, there never is one reason why it happens. There's no one reason why anything happens. It's an accumulation of a lot of things. Now, there may be one particular episode that is, as we call, the straw on the camel's back. It could be something, made it snap and brought everything to light and made an explosion of all the inner trauma or negative feelings that somebody has. And you can point to that episode. But there's normally a lot of things that go on to this. And when the rabbis were discussing how did this happen to Elisha Ben Avuya, we actually find many different commentaries in the Talmud, Jerusalem, Babylonian Talmud, in the Medrash, pointing to different factors in his life and why it happened. And we're going to go through a collection that I've made. I think this is most of them, if not all of them. So, source number 2 is this first answer. It comes from the Jerusalem Talmud. Let me just explain. The Jerusalem Talmud was the Talmud that was produced by the scholars in the schools in Israel, not just in Jerusalem. In fact, mostly in northern Israel and other places. Yavne, Tiberias, where the Galilee, where the great schools were. And that was redacted by Rabbi Yochanan in around the end of the 3rd century. The Babylonian Talmud was mostly the contribution of the rabbis in the Babylonian schools. Surah, Pumbedisa, Neherda, and others like those. And that was redacted about 2 centuries later by Ravina and Rav Ashi and great Amoraim. And therefore, by the way, when you have a dispute between the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, we normally accord with the Babylonian Talmud, even though it wasn't made in Israel, it was made outside of Israel. But because it was printed 200 years later, we say that they had the chance to see and review the Jerusalem Talmud and be able to crystallize and possibly change some of the rulings as well. That may become an important point later in tonight's class. So, in the Jerusalem Talmud, Chagiga, chapter 2, passage 1, it says as follows. We're going to explore some of the many stages of his lifetime. When Acher, who's Acher? So if you remember, we got into this topic because of last week's class. Last week's class, we learned the story about the 4 sages who entered into the orchard, entered into the Pardes, entered into heaven to glimpse at the truth of God, try to understand the biggest mysteries of the universe. Why do bad things happen to good people? Why did the wicked prosper? And these unanswerable questions, they're trying to peer behind the curtain, things that we're not supposed to know about, not allowed to know about, not able to know about. Well, the 4 entered. One of them died. One of them went mentally insane. Elisha Ben Avuya became a heretic. And Rabbi Akiva entered and left in peace. And we spoke about that last week. See last week's class in the link on YouTube, Facebook, if you want to learn more about it. Elisha Ben Avuya became the heretic. He's tonight's topic. He became known as Acher. Acher means the other, or the outcast. He doesn't even get a name. If you want to label somebody with a derogatory name, you can give him a derogatory name. He doesn't even get a derogatory name. He's just called the outcast. We don't want to mention any name about him. He's just not one of us. We're going to learn in future more passages soon about more behind that name. In many of the later books, like of the Gaonim during the 9th, 10th century, they actually changed the vowelization of that, and instead of calling him Acher, the other, the outcast, they actually write him as Achor. Achor means to go backwards. Achor means to turn around and go the wrong way. He was the person that traveled backwards also in terms of his spiritual life. So the Jerusalem Talmud says when Acher was in the womb before birth, his mother would pass by houses of idolatry and inhale the scent of the incense from those idolatrous sacrifices. This scent penetrated her whole body and affected the fetus like the venom of a snake. Here you have already an interesting thing, a teaching about the importance of the nurture of not just when a child is born, not just when a child is a year before the bar mitzvah. Rabbi, what should we start doing now? How do you prepare him? Bar mitzvah preparations, life preparations begin from birth and even 9 months before birth, from conception. This is something that Talmud speaks about a lot 2,000 years ago. Science knows about this for the last few decades, how impressionable a fetus in the womb is, and the various things that a mother exposes the fetus to, whether it's foods she eats or music she listens to or external stimuli that the mother is exposed to, they all have profound influence on the fetus. We know this for sure, which is why it's so important to raise even a fetus in a state of health and purity and holiness and positivity. So the mother who would enjoy the scent of the fragrance from the idolatrous practices, that already, says the Talmud, played around with at least the spiritual DNA, with the spiritual status of this fetus. And it's in a way it's unfair. Like, poor guy, what did he do wrong? He didn't do anything wrong. But if chas v'shalom, if a mother ever, while she's carrying a baby, ever does something unhealthy and intakes or ingests things that are not healthy, it can damage the fetus. Then what does the fetus do wrong? Nothing. It's the mother's fault. I mean, as a mother, you've got to be very, very, as a father, as parents, you have to be very careful about this. So reason number one, the Talmud says it already started. The potential for this started by the various spiritual stains and spiritual kind of distractions that were imprinted on him as a fetus. Now he's born. Let's go a little bit later. Now we're going to go to the stage of his Brit. 8 days after he was born, his Brit Milah. Source number 3, the Medrash Rabbah in Ruth. Again, going to Ruth. Let me pull it up on the screen. There we go. Acher, again, he's called Acher. He related about himself. Avuya, my father, was a great man of his generation, and when the time came for my circumcision, he invited all the great men of Jerusalem, and he invited Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua among them. So like I said, he came from a very prominent family. The greatest rabbis of town came to his Brit Milah ceremony. And when they ate and drank and sang some songs and other alphabetic acrostics, they were playing games, they were schmoozing, they were drinking, making l'chaims. It was a very light-headed kind of gathering. So Rabbi Eliezer said to Rabbi Yeshua, these men are busying themselves on pointless things, and we're neglecting to pursue our affairs. We're scholars, we're pious people. So they began with the Torah, they studied Torah, they took out a book, they didn't have it on their iPhone, but they took out a sefer or a scroll. And from the Torah, they went to the book of the prophets, and from the prophets to the writings. It seemed like they had a lot of time to study a lot of things. And they rejoiced in these words as when they were given from Sinai, surrounding by flaming fire. As they were learning, it seems like they were generating a very holy aura around them, and there appeared to be like a flaming fire around them. And were they not given from Sinai in fire, as it is said? We're turning the page. Burned with a fire reaching up to the heart of the sky. So Avuya, the father, who's entertaining his guests and giving out l'chaim and enjoying a joke, he sees these two people studying Torah, and he has this vision, this flame of fire surrounding them, just like it's the re-experiencing the giving of the Torah at Sinai. So he's so impressed, and Avuya said, so great is the power of the Torah, this son of mine, if he survives, I will offer to give him to the Torah. If he survives, meaning, I guess in those days, not all children, much less than today. The mortality rate was very high. And he's so impressed by the bliss and by the aura of these great rabbis studying Torah that he says, I want the same bliss for my son. And therefore I'm going to devote my life to educating my son in that kind of path. Elisha Ben Avuya heard that story when he was growing up. It was about him. And he said, because the intention of my father's thought was not for the sake of heaven, the Torah did not continue in me. Very strong words. My father got excited. My father had the best intentions from me, so to speak. And he wanted me to have that life of bliss and that holiness like those rabbis had. But that is not a true intention. That is not what we call Torah lishma, Torah for the sake of God. We don't study Torah for personal agendas, for personal benefits. I want to have the peace. I want to have the good life. I want to have the honor. I want to have that spiritual bliss in my life. When some people study Torah and they don't get that kind of honor or spiritual bliss, so what? That's not the reason. The reason is because it's the mitzvah. It's the way to connect with God. It's studying the script of our life. So Elisha Ben Avuya says, because my father had a wrong, disingenuous intention that already clouded and distorted his education of me throughout my life, and it's the very seeds of distortion, the seeds of genuineness that were planted in me, that eventually the Torah was not genuine within me, and the Torah left me. It's a very harsh comment to make about your parents. As parents, we try to do our best. But Elisha says, I have an episode with my mother. He must need a lot of therapy. He's complaining about his mother when he was in vitro. He's complaining about his father, about comments that he made during his Brit Milah. Gary says, sounds similar to what Rachel experienced with Esau. So, yes, you mean Rivka. So Rivka, so it's a bit different. Rivka was carrying two babies. It says when she passed by a church, one baby would get excited, an idolatrous home, house of worship. And when she passed by a synagogue, also the baby got excited. So she was freaking out. What kind of baby is this? He wants to go to the church and to the synagogue. So then she's told, no, you have two different children. You have twins. One twin becomes excited by this, and one excited by... But there, I don't think we don't have any knowledge that Rivka did anything to nurture and support the inclinations of Esau. That was Esau's inclination for whatever reason. But here, Elisha is saying my mother did things which actually ended up causing me spiritual harm. Hope that makes sense to you, Gary. Okay, next. What are some other reasons why Acher left the fold? This is quote number 4 from the Talmud in Kedushin, page 39b. The Gemara asks straight out, and what caused Acher to sin? Well, there are those who say he saw a case like the following. Listen to the story that happened. It's taught in a Braita that Rabbi Yaakov says, there is not a single mitzvah written in the Torah whose reward is stated alongside it, which is not dependent on the resurrection of the dead. In general, we believe in reward and punishment. It's one of the foundations and the pillars of Jewish faith, which means everything we do actually has meaning to God. God cares about what we do. If we do the right thing, there's a reward. If we do the wrong thing, there's a punishment. But what are the rewards and the punishments? So it's not like if you're going to sin, then a bolt of lightning in heaven is going to fall down upon you. Because if you tell that to your child and then he sins and then the lightning didn't come, he says, well, then it's not true, the whole thing. That's not how it works. And it's not like if you do a mitzvah, then all of a sudden you're going to find a deposit of a few extra zeros in your bank account tomorrow morning. It's not how it works either. We're actually not told for the most part, the rewards and punishment for many, many sins. At least the reward we're not told about. So the idea is that the rewards are not really in this world. Most of the rewards are in Olam Haba. That's what Rabbi Yaakov teaches. However, there are 2 exceptions, 2 mitzvot where the Torah says, I'll tell you the reward, and it's in this world. With regarding to honoring one's parents, father and mother, the Torah says clearly that your days may be long and there may be goodwill with you. Honoring your parents gives you long life here in this world. And with regarding to the mitzvah of what? Of dispatching the mother bird from the nest. As you know, if you want to take the eggs or the chicks from a nest, you have to send the mother bird away 50 amot. It's called shiluach haken. And if you do that, that's a big mitzvah. And you don't want to harm the mother when you're taking the eggs or the chicks. And it says about that mitzvah, when you do that, same thing, that it may be well with you and that you may prolong your days. These are 2 mitzvot, honoring your parents and shooing away the mother bird, where we're told you're going to have a good long life here in this world. Despite this, it occurred that there was one person whose father said to him, a young boy, the father said, climb to the top of the building and fetch me the chicks. In other words, shoo away the mother bird and bring me the chicks. He climbed to the top of the building and dispatched the mother bird, as the mitzvah says, and took the young. But upon his return, he started to climb down the ladder from a tall tree. He fell and he died. Where is the goodness of the days of this one? Where is the length of the days of this one? How could the story happen? Here, he was fulfilling both of the mitzvot, honoring his father and shooing away the mother bird to collect the chicks, both of the mitzvot, which are the only two mitzvot that we're told about their reward, is a good long life here in this world, and he dies right away. How could that happen? So Rabbi Yaakov, who incidentally happened to be, as the Talmud says, the grandson of Acher, he was the son of the daughter of Acher. He explains that when the Torah says it'll be well with you, it doesn't necessarily mean in this world. It means in the world where all is well. Olam haba. When the Torah says your days may be long, it doesn't mean in this world, but it's referring to the world that is entirely long. So Rabbi Yaakov explains those verses are also only referring to Olam haba. However, Acher did not agree or believe or know about that interpretation. That was given by his grandson. I don't know if he ever heard it from his grandson, or maybe he didn't want to listen to his grandson. In fact, Rabbi Yosef said, had Acher interpreted this aforementioned verse homiletically, like his grandson did, as referring to the world to come, he would not have sinned. Acher was turned off because he saw a story that to him it flew in the face of what the Torah said. The Torah said there's going to be long life for this child for the two mitzvahs that he does, and it didn't happen. It didn't happen. He was let down. And he concluded the Torah is not true. And if that's the case, he turned his back on the whole Torah. Achor. He went backwards. Achor. Achor is a back. Achora. He turned his back on the Torah. Here's another explanation. There are those that say, what happened to Acher? He saw the tongue of Chutzpis, the translator. There was a great rabbi, his name was Chutzpis. That may not have been his real name, that may be his nickname. Because what was his role? His role was the translator, meaning when the sages, the head of the academies, would teach and lecture, very often the way they were speaking, it was way too high, way too much, way too profound for the students to understand. So there was a middleman, a translator, who would take the teachings, the concept that the teacher was conveying, and then explain it. So Rabbi Gamliel, who was the great head of the academy, he had a great translator whose name was Chutzpis. Now, the skill of a translator is profound because, number one, you have to be able to understand all the wisdom of the sage. So you're on par with the sage. But number two, you have an additional talent, which the sage does not have, that you can actually break it down, break the wisdom into a lower form and communicate it with students who their minds are much less knowledgeable or less capable than the mind of the sage. So it's a very talented person, a very learned person. And that's why he may have the nickname Chutzpis. Chutzpis comes from the word chutzpah. You have to have a bit of chutzpah to be able to take the words of the master and understand it, at least believe you understand it, and then dress it up and communicate it in a different kind of way. It's a job. You have to be very assertive, be very bold and proud and confident to be able to do that. Now, Chutzpis was such a great sage. He was one of the 10 people that the Romans martyred, the Romans killed. Each one of them was a gruesome death. We know some of them, their skin was flayed, and some of them were thrown into the fire. So many gruesome stories, like we've learned some of them in the past. Well, Chutzpis was killed in a way that we're not taught how he was killed exactly, but after he was killed, I think after he was killed, maybe even not, they took his tongue and they cut off his tongue. And the Romans, and they threw the tongue out in the street. And Acher saw that the tongue was being dragged along by something else. That's the literal words of the Talmud. Something else in Hebrew is davar acher. Davar acher is the euphemism for a pig, for a swine. The pig is the iconic non-kosher animal, so we try not to use the word pig. It's a word of impurity, so it's called davar acher, the other thing. We have that very common. Like, for example, in Yiddish, when you want to talk about a certain illness, that's a very harsh illness called cancer, you don't say the word cancer. You say yenamachla. You say that disease. We don't want to make reference to these harsh, negative things. So this swine is carrying in its mouth the tongue of Chutzpis. And Acher said, shall a mouth that produced pearls lap up dirt? Here you have a guy who was the highest of the high, the greatest of the great. He was the cause of spreading Torah so far and so wide, more than the sages did, because he was actually making it understandable and communicating it to everybody. And yet here his tongue, his power was in his words, and his tongue is lying in the street, desecrated, being carried by a swine. And for this reason, Acher left, he went out and sinned. Another explanation, this time back to the Talmud in Chagiga 15. Right, that whole page 14, 15, 16 in Chagiga is full of the stories of Acher. There are stories in the Babylonian Talmud, some of the stories in the Jerusalem Talmud, some are the same, some are a little different, as we're going to see soon. And then the Medrash. So in all different sources, I've been collecting to get a full comprehensive picture. Here, the Talmud brings two other reasons. Acher, what was his failing? The Talmud asks. So the Gemara says, Greek tunes never ceased from his mouth. He always was singing Greek songs. What's wrong with that? So one commentary says it wasn't so much Greek songs, he was always singing songs. And after the temple was destroyed, especially in those early generations and early times, the Talmud, in fact, made decrees. And there were decrees how communities should behave. And there was one of these things that we should not indulge in celebration. For example, King David says, then our mouths will be filled with laughter. Then when Mashiach will come, we'll be redeemed. But now in the time of exile, now our eyes have witnessed so much death and persecution and decimation of the Jewish people, we don't indulge in pleasure, in laughter, in song. And so they were much more subdued. There were people who didn't eat any meat anymore, people who wouldn't sleep on a bed anymore, people who would not sing. We don't sing. It used to be, I don't know if it still is today, there used to be a decree, an edict in Jerusalem that when you have weddings, bar mitzvahs, you're not allowed to have a full-piece band. You're only allowed to have a one-man band. I don't think it's anymore today. Maybe some people still do it. Because in Jerusalem, which is the heart and seat of where it all happened, where everything went down, to just act frivolously with a 49-piece orchestra and sing and dance as if nothing happened and life is good is disrespectful. So the fact that Acher would sing so much, that caused or that displayed his disrespect for the temple, for those who were killed, for the victims, and that showed his disregard for that. Another commentary says it's not only about the songs, but it's about the Greek songs. The Greeks were the people who threatened the Jewish people. They tried to destroy the temple. They lured so many Jewish people away from Jewish faith, from real faith, towards hedonistic life, towards Hellenistic life, towards the pagan beliefs of the Greeks. And so all of their art and all of their music carried those themes which we believe are heretical themes, are themes that are paganistic. They're against everything we believe in. And so the idea, today we talk about a goyish nigun, a non-Jewish song. There are non-Jewish songs which are beautiful songs, but a non-Jewish song that carries in it, especially if it's composed by someone who their belief system, their faith system is completely contrary to Jewish faith, and you put your heart and soul into composing a song, and the themes of the song we don't sing them. We don't sing them because they're harmful to us. And Elisha just enjoyed the Greek lifestyle, the Greek teachings, the Greek music, and that played with him and played with his heart and his soul and with his faith, and that influenced him in a way to leave the Torah. Finally, one last explanation of why did he leave, and this is actually a review of the episode we learned last week, but I want to draw your attention to it again. The final explanation that the Talmud gives is, there's one more. Similarly, before the last one, they said about Acher, when he would stand after learning in the study hall, many heretical books will fall from his lap. So he's sitting with his chavrusa, he's in the yeshiva, and he's at his table, and he has his Gemara in front of him, and his Mishnayot, and his Rambam, and all the holy books studying, but on his lap, he's looking down. Why are you looking down? When a student's sitting in class at a desk, but they're not looking into the book, they're looking down. What's going on over there? So nowadays, there's probably the phone. And the phone is probably playing the latest basketball game or a movie that he's watching. Well, Acher had his head down here, and what was on his lap? Books of heresy, books of philosophy, books that were contrary to Jewish belief. So you try to, cover yourself up and no one should see it, etc. But once Acher was so engrossed in the learning with his chavrusa, with his study partner, that he stood up abruptly for whatever reason. He forgot that these books were on his lap, and all of these books of heresy spilled out on the floor, and everyone turns around and they think that books of Talmud fell on the floor. Quick, pick it up, kiss it, put it back on the table. And they see, no. This is, Aristotle, or this is all other kinds of heretical works. So again, the things he was exposing himself to, the music, the books, ended up playing with him, ended up tainting him, and ended up sending him off course, which, by the way, is a good lesson for us and for our children and students when we're trying to keep them in the path of holiness, path of morality, path of spirituality, path of Torah. You have to be very careful what we allow them to be exposed to, because things that can play with their minds in unhealthy ways are dangerous. And now, finally, the last explanation of the Talmud, which is the story you're familiar with already. The sages taught 4 rabbis entered the Pardes, entered the orchard, Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, and Rabbi Akiva. Now, Ben Azai died, Ben Zoma went mentally insane, Rabbi Akiva came out in peace, but Acher chopped down the shoots of saplings. He cut down the trees, meaning he was in the orchard, and he had a shift, a spiritual shift of faith, a crisis of faith in that moment. In other words, he became a heretic. What happened? So we gave different explanations, but the Gemara says he saw the angel Mitatron, who was granted permission to sit in heaven and write the merits of Israel. And Elisha Ben Avuya, Acher, was alarmed. Somebody else besides God is deciding reward and punishment, and someone else besides God is sitting in heaven. You're not allowed to sit in heaven. Perhaps he says, heaven forbid, there are 2 authorities. Could it be that there's another God? It's not just one God over here? So he started to realize it's not how he thought he believed. This angel Mitatron was granted permission to erase the merits of Acher and cause him to stumble in any manner. Acher was punished because of his heresy. And finally, and this is a very important part of the Talmud we're going to be talking about tonight, finally a divine voice went forth, a bat kol, and it said in Hebrew, it quoted a verse from Jeremiah. The verse says, Shuvu banim shovavim. God says, return, my children who are shovavim, who are rebellious. There's an appeal. Jeremiah was telling the people towards the end of the destruction of the first temple, friends, it's time to return. All of your rebellious ways, your idolatrous ways, your immoral ways, time to return. So the Bizbasko pipes up and says, rebellious ones, my children, time to return. Chutz me'acher, except for Acher. Acher cannot return. And Elisha Ben Avuya heard that. And it's one thing when he had a crisis of faith and he left and he became a heretic, okay, but maybe one day he can wake up and come back. But here, says the bat called the heavenly voice, everyone else, no matter how rebellious you are, every sinner can come back. But Acher is never welcome back into heaven, never welcome back into the community. You're out. Upon hearing this, Elisha Ben Avuya said, since that man has been banished from that world, meaning myself, let him go and enjoy this world. Okay, if God doesn't want me, then I don't want God. Then I no longer have any conscience, any accountability. I can do what I want. Right? God's not my God anymore. So Acher went astray. What did he do? He went very extreme. He went and he found a prostitute and he solicited her. She said, now she looked at him and he looked a little familiar. So she said to him, are you not Elisha Ben Avuya? You're the great rabbi. You're the great sage. Everyone talks about. You're so popular. You're coming to me to solicit my services. It was Shabbat. He uprooted a radish from a patch of radishes on Shabbat and gave it to her. In other words, he performed a sin, a violation of Shabbat, to uproot a plant which is growing. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbat. He did that in front of her and he gave it to her. Basically, he told her, this is me. This is the new me. So when she saw that, she tells him, oh, this is other. This is not Elisha Ben Avuya. This is another. Hu Acher. It's another person. Now, what does she mean when she says that? So there's different explanations. Either she means, I must have made a mistake. Wrong person. You must look like him, but you're not really him. Or it means you are him. But previously you were him, meaning Elisha Ben Avuya, you were the great rabbi, the great sage, but now you're not that sage anymore. You have changed. Now you're Acher. Now you're an outcast of the community. So here are 2 sources where Acher receives the name Acher. Earlier, when he became the heretic, there was a heavenly voice coming from heaven who said, everyone is welcome to do teshuvah except for Acher. God, the heavenly voice, calls him Acher, proclaims him as an outcast. Acher realizes he's an outcast, he may as well go and enjoy life. And now the woman, the prostitute that he meets, says, oh, you're also Acher. So from above and from below, from heaven and from earth, he's given the title outcast. Wherever he goes, he is the Acher. So, let's summarize before we go further. We have now given, I don't know, how many explanations? Why did Acher turn away? Something that happened in pregnancy when his mother smelled the fragrance of the idols. Or by his Brit Milah, his father had a disingenuous agenda for training him with Torah. Or the story where there were 2 mitzvot that the son performed, the 2 mitzvot that he's supposed to get long life for, and he died on the spot. That turned him off. Or he saw Chutzpis, the translated, the great rabbi, how he was butchered by the Romans and his tongue was laying in the waist in the mouth of a swine, and he said, this can't be true. Or he was too much immersed in Greek song and Greek ideology. Or he was exposing himself to heretical works. Or the story that happened when he entered into heaven and he received the crisis of faith and he thought maybe there's more than one God, there's 2 gods, and he leaves the path. Like I said earlier, all of these reasons are true. It takes a lot to give a person a crisis of faith, and a person who's raised in an environment like his home, prominent Jewish, active, vibrant, and he becomes a leading scholar among the Jewish people, and then to leave all that, it's such a devastation for the community, it's such a devastation for him. How does that happen? There's a lot of factors, a lot of trauma, a lot of stuff that goes on in a person's life, and eventually this is the decision that they make. So here we have the tragedy of the downfall of Acher. By the way, I once saw a commentary, if you're into gematria number games, that says that if you take the name Elisha, what's the numerical value of the name Elisha? 411, right? Aleph is 1, Lamed is 30, Yud is 10, Shin is 300, Ayin is 7, you get 411. If you minus from that the numerical value of Rav means the master, the teacher, Rav is 202. So Elisha, the 411 minus, take away, strip him of his title of Rav, of Rebbe, you're left with 209. 209 is the numerical value of Acher. So Acher is the name when he took the original Elisha and he stripped him of his title, of his credentials of being a spiritual rabbi. Now, what did he do after he became Acher and he became this heretic? So we mentioned earlier that not only was he excommunicated from the Jewish community, but in fact he started to threaten and haunt the Jewish community. And in fact, he partnered together with the Romans in their efforts to destroy and persecute the Jewish community. So here are some examples. In source number 6, we're on the next page. Let me bring it up. So in the Jerusalem Talmud, Chagiga, chapter 2, it says as follows: Acher would enter the houses of study and convince the young students to leave their studies and pursue other goals. You'll make a good builder, he said. You'll make a good carpenter. And he took people and he sort of said, what are you sitting and studying Torah and wasting your time? You could go and open a company and launch an app, and you can go invest, and you can get into the stock market, and you can make it big. Don't waste your time studying Torah over here. And he lured away many students from the yeshiva, from the Torah. And then something else very mean of him. The Romans were trying to abolish Torah and mitzvot in the Jewish community. And one of the main mitzvot they were attacking was Shabbat. Shabbat is something that has preserved the Jewish people forever. And if you take away Shabbat from them, you're really stripping them of their heart and soul. So the Romans forced the Jewish people to work on Shabbat. And one of the work you had to do, there's one of the 39 categories of prohibited labor is called hotza'ah, is carrying. If you take an item and you carry it from a private domain from your house onto the street, the public domain, you've transferred from one to another domain, that's not allowed on Shabbat. Or from the public to a private domain, you're not allowed to do that. So the Romans brought all these Jews into one of their factories or stores and ordered them, we need you to schlep these boxes from here out onto the street, into the truck, wherever. They gave them this work to do on Shabbat, forcing them to violate Shabbos. Now, when the Romans forced the Jews to work on Shabbat, by having them carry items from the private to public domain, The Jews paired up and carried each item with 2 people. The Jews were clever. The law is, if there's an item that I can carry by myself, and if I were to carry it from the private domain to the public domain on Shabbat, that's a violation of the laws of Shabbat. If you and I carry it together, each one of us is doing like a half a malacha, a half prohibited labor, so none of us are liable. If it's a very heavy item that requires both of us to carry it, then we're each liable for carrying. But if we can both are carrying a very light item, then we're patur, we're exempt from violating the Shabbos law. So the Jews, as they were schlepping boxes, they weren't so heavy, they decided 2 are going to carry together. Like this, they're going to prevent themselves from violating Shabbos Torah law. Well, when Acher saw that, he turns to the Romans and he says, you know what I suggest? I know what the trick they're up to. You should force them to carry the item single-handedly. He didn't want to let the Jews off the hook, that they're trying their best to circumvent violating Shabbos. You're going to have to carry the item on your own and violate Shabbos. That's what Acher dedicates his life. It's one thing he left the fold, but now he wants to attract and lure away all the other Jews from the Torah as well. And now there's a story. Back to the Babylonian Talmud, Chagiga 15b. Listen to this story. Acher had a very prized student. He had many students, but one student who actually stayed with him even after he became a heretic was Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir, we've learned about him in a previous class a few months ago. He was one of the greatest of the greats also. Rabbi Meir had a brilliant mind, a beautiful soul. The Torah that he taught was out of this world. In fact, his name, Meir means to illuminate. And the Talmud says that may not have been his real name, but he got that name because his Torah illuminated a conversation, illuminated a topic. Whatever he said was gold. In fact, so much so, sometimes the law is not like him when there's an argument. And what's the reason? Because he was too brilliant. He was too amazing. No one really understood things that he said. That's how great he was. Now, actually, I think next week we're going to learn about the relationship of Acher and Rabbi Meir together. That's next week's topic, something fascinating as well. But here's one conversation. Acher asked Rabbi Meir, his student, a question. This is after he'd gone astray, after he became Acher. He asked him, what is the meaning of a verse in Job, in Eov? The verse says, gold and glass cannot equal it, neither shall its exchange be vessels of fine gold. It's referring to Torah. No matter how much beauty you have, and no matter how many prized possessions and wealth and glass and gold that you have, nothing is compared to the value, the beauty, the thrill of the wealth of having possession of Torah, Torah knowledge, Torah life. But why does the verse speak about gold and glass? It's a little strange. Gold, I understand. Gold is a precious gem, but glass? I mean, maybe glass back then was a little more precious than it is today, but still, glass doesn't compare to gold. So he's asking him, why is gold and glass mentioned in the verse? So Rabbi Meir, his student, tells him, it's referring to words of Torah, which are as difficult to acquire as gilded vessels and vessels of fine gold, but are as easy to lose as glass vessels. It's hard to find gold. It's hard to acquire gold. It's hard to acquire Torah. You have to work hard. You have to study hard. You have to work on your midot, work on your character. If you want to be a Torah Jew, acquire the knowledge of Torah and live the lifestyle of Torah, it's a life change. It's a life's effort. You have to work very hard. However, if you're looking to drop Torah, if you're looking to turn around and walk away, it can happen like this. You drop a glass and it breaks. All of a sudden, it breaks quickly. So the Torah and the glass, the two metaphors show on how fragile sometimes a person's relationship with Torah can be. That was Rabbi Meir's response, which was the way he was trying to communicate something to his teacher. He's saying, Acher, look how hard you worked to become the Elisha Ben Avuya sage and scholar that you became. And then it all fell to pieces so quickly, like glass. Acher responds to his student and he says, Rabbi Akiva, your teacher, did not say so. That wasn't what Rabbi Akiva taught. He had a different explanation. What's Rabbi Akiva's explanation? Just as golden vessels and glass vessels have a remedy, even when they have broken, gold and glass are similar, not different. Gold, if gold gets bent out of shape, you can heat it up and weld it back together, shade it back together. Glass, the same thing. If you know what you're doing, even if it's cracked and it's broken, you can heat it up once again, you can weld it back together. So no matter how broken they've become, these two metals, these two materials can be fixed. So to a Torah scholar, even though he's transgressed and led a life of sin, he always has a remedy. The metaphor of golden glass is to say that no matter how low you've fallen, you can always get back up. This is the explanation of Rabbi Akiva, which Acher is informing and teaching his student, Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir pounced on this explanation. He said, whoa, if that's the case, he turns to his teacher and he says, Acher, if so, you too, gold, glass, you can return from your evil ways. You can be fixed. There's a remedy. Come back. Acher said, I've already heard the following declaration behind the dividing curtain. I already heard this baskol, this heavenly voice come out, and it said, as we learned earlier, Shuvu banim shovavim, return rebellious children, chutz mi Acher, except for Acher. I've already been told that I'm not welcome. There's no hope for me. We're going to learn, as you can see already, this baskol, this heavenly voice that sort of seemed to exclude him from everyone else, was a proclamation, was something that stayed in his mind forever. He never forgot about it. It haunted him. It tormented him. It traumatized him. He lived with it, or he couldn't live because of it. He was forever going to be outcasted by God, by heaven. We're going to learn more about that in a moment. Time's running late. We may go a little over time, but we have to get to the end. The end is such a precious, such a gem of a teaching. Okay. What happened when Acher dies, when he passes away? So we have an interesting teaching in the Jerusalem Talmud. And this is source number 8. And it goes like this. It says, when Acher fell ill, Rabbi Meir went to visit him. On his deathbed, he's breathing his last breaths. And Rabbi Meir never gave up on his teacher. And he says, my teacher, you haven't got long left to live. Why don't you return? There's not much life left to enjoy. Do teshuvah. Die a righteous person. Oh, he says, it's too late for me. No. Rabbi Meir says, no, absolutely not. It's not too late, because the verse says in Tehillim in Psalms chapter 90, Kashev enosh ad daka. God lowers man to a crashing point. And then he says, Shuvu b'nei adam, return. Now the word daka can also come from the word dichducha in Hebrew, which means even when man is at his lowest point and last moments, there's just moments left in life, God still says, Shuva b'nei adam, you can return to me no matter the kind of life that you've lived. That was Rabbi Meir's response to him. Now, the Talmud says, Elisha began to cry and then passed away. Rabbi Meir rejoiced and he said, my master has repented and he's died about teshuvah. This is a passage in the Jerusalem Talmud which we do not find anywhere in the Babylonian Talmud. Meaning, according to the Babylonian Talmud, there is no evidence that he died after doing teshuvah. There's no evidence that his student Rabbi Meir ever felt that he did teshuvah. In the Babylonian Talmud, he goes down on record having lived and then died as the heretic. We're just going to learn one paragraph from the next quote. The rest we're going to do next week. But here's a dilemma that happened in heaven when he passed away. When Acher passed away, the heavenly court declared that he should not be judged, nor brought into the world to come. What do you do with the guy? So we know when you die, and you go to the pearly white gates, and now you're going to go to the left and to the right, to heaven, to hell, right? What happens? So if you're a righteous person, you go to heaven. If you're a sinner, you go to hell. Where should Acher go? There was a big dilemma in heaven. When Acher's soul came to heaven, where should he go? We can't put him. He should not be judged. We can't send him to purgatory because he occupied himself with Torah. And Torah is such a powerful force that it protects a person. It always stands by your side as a defense measure. He can't be sent to heaven, to the world to come, because he was sinned. So in the end, Acher's soul remains in limbo. Doesn't go to purgatory, doesn't go to heaven. It remains nowhere. He was another, even in heaven, he became an Acher, an outcast. He had nowhere to go. Now, the rest of that story and what did happen to his soul, we're going to study next week. But I want to do two more sources with you and conclude with an unbelievable teaching that we can take from Acher. First, in source 9, oh, my numbers are wrong. My apologies. It's really source 10. In source 10, we're on page 4. There's actually one teaching in the Mishnah that we still have in the name of Elisha Ben Avuya. There's one more teaching also in the Talmud, a separate idea, a law in his name. But here's a teaching in Pirkei Avot, chapter 4, Mishnah 20. And it's an interesting teaching. I'm sure he was expressing a lot of himself in this teaching. And the teaching goes like this, and it says, Elisha the son of Avuya would say, one who learns Torah in his childhood, what is that comparable to? To ink inscribed on fresh paper. One who learns Torah in his old age, what is this comparable to? To ink inscribed on erased paper. When you have fresh paper, you put ink on it, it holds. When you have paper that's been worn and erased, and you put ink on it, it doesn't hold very well. And it can easily become erased, it can easily scratch and easily crack and fall off. Elisha was saying, you have to value the formative years of a person, of a child. Never to say, let's wait till they grow up and then we're going to instill within them values, Torah, faith, what you can absorb, what you can pick up, how you can be the impressions of things that we study, we're exposed to as a young child, last forever. There's a lot, we know this scientifically, we know this, but here the Talmud, Rabbi Elisha Ben Avuya taught this. Versus things that you start to learn or try to absorb when you're older are much harder to penetrate, much harder to stick, much harder to truly comprehend. But as a child, which is, if you want to nurture children that have real faith and real access to Torah and real Jewish values and a real lifestyle of doing a mitzvah and living up to their spiritual calling, the time to start is when they're a child. The time to start is when they're born. The time to start is 9 months before they're born, as we said earlier. And Elisha Ben Avuya perhaps is alluding to what he felt he got a little bit of an unfortunate start in life. Not that he didn't get a proper education at home. So here it's very subtle. He got a great education. He came from a very prominent home with a lot of Torah and a lot of values and a lot of teaching. But certain things happened in his childhood that he felt, already tainted his soul, his life. And that led to his eventual becoming an acher and his spiritual destruction. But the importance of taking the education of our children so seriously. Okay. Now the final lesson for tonight. And if this is all you walk away with, it's worth it. And you get this treat because you stood here till the very end. A different version provides a powerful lesson. I mentioned a few times already that the way some of the stories are listed in the Jerusalem Talmud or in the Babylonian Talmud are a little different. Now, remember, we've learned already, I think, 2 times in 2 sources, and there are more such sources in the Talmud which I did not bring down tonight. Elisha often reflected on the heavenly voice that he heard coming out of heaven. And the heavenly voice said, return even rebellious children, except for Acher. Acher cannot return. And like I said, that becomes his response to many times that he's Rabbi Meir or others who asked him, why don't you return? It's time to return. And there were other stories that I did not bring in the source sheets. And he always quoted that heavenly voice. And he said, because I'm not allowed to. God doesn't welcome me anymore. God has thrown me out of the Jewish community. I'm not part of the Jewish people. I'm not part of your story anymore. I'm not part of the Jewish narrative. Now, the way this is quoted in the Jerusalem Talmud is a little different. And I want you to notice the difference, and it's not by mistake. And these subtle differences actually present an enormous teaching. And what I'm about to teach you was actually taught, I learned it from the great Rabbi Joseph Ber Soloveitchik, who was the great rabbi, eventually came to America after the war, a little before the war, in fact, and he became a great rabbi in Boston, and he was the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the Talmudic University, the Yeshiva University, And he was a major teacher, thinker, scholar, sage, writer, author, and he influenced a generation of Torah scholars. And he gave a speech once in New Jersey in 1961, and he focused on this point that I'm about to share with you, and he offered an unbelievable teaching. Listen carefully. This is the version in the Jerusalem Talmud. Rabbi Meir asked Acher, "You're so filled with wisdom. Why don't you return? Okay, you've had challenge in life, you've had trauma, you've had all kinds of doubts and all kinds of things that have happened to you, but you know more than we know. You know the truth. You know where it's really at. You know about God and about Torah. You've had your time, and now you tasted the taste of sin. It's time to get back. Why don't you return?" So he says, "I can't." "But why?" Rabbi Meir insists. "What's stopping you?" So he says, "One time, I was riding on my horse on Yom Kippur, which fell out on Shabbat. And I passed by the holy place." In the original, it's Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies. Now, the Holy of Holies was the most holiest place in the temple, on the Temple Mount, by the Dome of the Rock over there. There was no temple anymore, but he passed by that location. It was still the Holy of Holies. So, it's Shabbat. It's Yom Kippur. And he's riding on his horse, which you're not allowed to do on Shabbat or Yom Kippur. And he's riding by the Holy of Holies. Why? Why is he riding there? You know, if you want to go ride, you go ride when no one sees you. Go ride in Montana. Go ride in somewhere in the south, somewhere in the north, by the mountains. You know, on the Holy of Holies. You know, everyone's going to be walking to synagogue and walking in the streets. Yom Kippur, everyone's going to see you. He was trying to make a statement. He was trying to say, Shabbat, Yom Kippur, Holy of Holies, I'm riding my horse. But when I did that, I heard the heavenly voice. And it proclaimed, "Return, my children, rebellious ones, Shuba Banim Shavavim, Chutz me Elisha Benavoya, except for Elisha the son of Avuya, who knows my strength and rebels against me." Did you hear that? Did you notice anything different? In the Babylonian Talmud, every time he hears that proclamation or refers to the proclamation, he says, the proclamation said, "Return, my children, except for Acher." In the Jerusalem Talmud, it says, what did he hear? "Return, my children, except for Elisha Ben Avuya." Which one was true? Which one did the heavenly voice really say? Except for Acher or except for Elisha Ben Avuya? His real original name or the name that he received as an Acher, as an outcast? So here is the important teaching. It's one thing when somebody says something, it's another thing what you hear. You know, when you're talking, it's a very important tool for communication. When I say something to another person, I need to be aware of what I'm saying and choose my words carefully. But then I need to be aware of what are they hearing from me. Because what they're hearing from me may not be what I'm saying or what I'm trying to say, right? And that's because people hear things differently. And so if you're the listener, what are you hearing the person actually say? And if you're the speaker, recognize that a listener may be hearing something different than what you're really saying. A lot of times I give a class or I say something and someone else tells me what I said, and I actually never said that, or I never did not intend to say that, or that was not really what I was trying to say, right? So what did the heavenly voice say? But what did Elisha Ben Avuya hear? Let's think about this. Elisha Ben Avuya, who was he, really? He was a pious, righteous, sage, saint, and scholar. He was the greatest rabbis that we had in history. And then something overcame him. Whatever the explanation, whatever the reason is, we learned the many reasons before, but he eventually left that all. And he became a heretic. He fell so low. What's important to understand, and what the Talmud is trying to say, and what the God was trying to proclaim in the heavenly voice, is that you should know all that you have become is not really you. It's Acher. It's a pseudo persona of yours. Acher, it's the other. It's an additional, imposed characteristic over you. It's not you. It's another you, a secondary. You are not a sinner. You are not a heretic. You are a Torah scholar. You are deeply bound with the Jewish faith and with God. And when something else overcame you, it's a spirit of folly, as the sages teach in the Talmud. A spirit of folly overcomes you and therefore forces you to do something, and therefore you act out of line. But it's not really you. We know who you really are, right? With a child. Very often a child acts out, right? So when a child acts out, if you're the teacher or the parent, don't make the mistake of saying, you see, they're a naughty child. I'm not a naughty child. They're a beautiful child. They're an innocent child. They come from a good home. They get a good education. They had an episode. They got excited about something, or something was bothering them, or who knows what, and they acted out. When they act out, that's not them at the moment. It's not really them. It's somebody else. It's something else. It's a pseudo character of them. And what you should be doing as an educator is trying to figure out who you truly are and strengthen that and nurture that, so they don't fall trapped to becoming that other superimposed persona of themselves. When the Babylonian Talmud teaches us, and we always go like the Babylonian Talmud, like I said, that the heavenly voice said that all my children can return except for Acher. Who's Acher? What was God telling Elisha Ben Avuya? God was telling Elisha Ben Avuya, Acher is also not able to return. Acher is not the real you. You're not Acher. You're Elisha Ben Avuya. Acher is that shtick, that spirit of folly that you've got caught up with. Okay, it's no good. Not good. We need to work on that. We need to realign you with your real self. But don't fool yourself. Don't kid yourself. Don't think that you've lost it. Don't think that Elisha Ben Avuya has become somebody else. Elisha Ben Avuya is still Elisha Ben Avuya. You're going through a passage called Acher. Acher is not welcome. But Acher is not you. You learn how to disassociate yourself from Acher. Learn how to figure out that Acher is not the true you. And if you can shed yourself of that Acher superimposed persona and discover who you really are, you'll come back. Of course you'll come back. Every sinner can come back. Isn't that the law and a major Jewish premise that no matter how low you're fallen, every sinner can return, can do teshuvah, return to God? What does it mean Acher cannot do teshuvah to God? Of course he can do teshuvah and return to God, but not Acher. Acher is not real. It's actually providing the tools how to do teshuvah, to figure out that all of those sins were not really you. That's what God really said. What did Acher hear? Acher heard what the Jerusalem Talmud says. All my rebellious children can return except for Elisha Ben Avuya. He heard that God was barring him, even as Elisha Ben Avuya, from returning to God. God never said that. God said your Acher persona is not welcome. Get rid of it. Discover the true you. But he identified himself as Acher. So he made a huge mistake, and that was his failing. When he had a moment of Acher, when anybody has a moment of Acher, we slip, we fall, we do something really inappropriate, we do something really harmful, we fell, we acted out of line, so uncharacteristic, so appalling. It can happen to anybody. Okay, you've got to make amends. You got to figure out how to fix it. If you harm somebody, you got to repair that harm, and then get back on track. Never make the mistake of saying, because I failed, therefore I'm a failure. You failed. You're not a failure. You sinned. You're not a sinner. You act like an acher. You behave like an outcast, but you're not an outcast. But Elisha Ben Avuya said to himself, if I behave like an outcast and I've gone astray and I've done the worst of the worst, then I am over. That's me. My story is left up to doom and gloom. I stand no chance. It was Elisha Ben Avuya's own fault, what he heard, that prevented him from ever coming back. He made the mistake of thinking that when God said Acher, God really means him, and that's not true. Elisha Ben Avuya is always welcome back into heaven. And that's a very powerful lesson for all of us to take home from this story. He died a tragic death. Of course, the Babylonian Talmud, he never did teshuvah. In fact, we're going to learn next week more about what happened to him in heaven. In heaven, they didn't know what to do with his soul in heaven, but he had to go through a serious cleansing. We'll learn about this next week. Us to recognize we make mistakes, it happens. Don't identify with that. That don't define you. Teshuvah means to recognize where you behaved uncharacteristically, it's not really you, and what is truly characteristic of you. It's real, it's beautiful, it's your pure self, it's your soul, it's your beautiful neshama, it's your connection with Hashem, it's the purpose of your life. God needs you here, God wants you here. Figure it out, put your pieces back together, and run with it. So that's a lesson from Acher. Hope you enjoyed this. My friends, have a good night. And we're going to return same time, same place next week. God bless you.